Are we ready? All right, welcome everybody to Constitution Day 2020 at Missouri Southern. I am Dr. Nicole Foster-Schoaf, Associate Professor of Political Science from the Missouri Southern's International and Political Affairs Program, and I'll serve as host for today's event. We organize an event each September 17th in recognition of Constitution Day, focused on helping us all understand our Constitution a bit better. And we seek to go beyond simple discussions of structures and emphasize the way the Constitution affects all of our daily lives. In recent years, we've talked about the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment and how our modern struggles with mass incarceration has its roots in the incomplete promise of the 13th Amendment. We've discussed the rising tensions between national security and personal privacy and the challenges that exist in applying the Fourth Amendment, written with a feather quill, to the 21st century technology like computers, smartphones, and GPS. Last year, in honor of the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which secured women the right to vote, we discussed how the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection has, to date, been unable to secure for American women genuine equality in the United States. Now this year, we're going to focus on the 200th anniversary of the Missouri Compromise, which paved the way for Missouri to become a state. To introduce us to the Missouri Compromise and the lingering consequences of this agreement, we have here with us the venerable Dr. Megan Bever, Associate Professor of History here at Missouri Southern. She'll help us better understand the historical context in which the Missouri Compromise was negotiated and offer us a framework on how to understand the ways in which we find ourselves still fighting the same battles today as we did 200 years ago. Following Dr. Bever's talk, we'll be joined by a panel of local scholars to discuss the Compromise, the Constitution, and how our history is reflected in our news reports today. So without further ado, Dr. Bever.
Thank you all for coming to join us today. I'm really glad that you're here, whether you're in the room or joining us via Zoom at some point today. As Professor Schoaf said, today we will be exploring the Missouri Compromise and its long-term ramifications for the constitutional question of slavery in the 19th century, and we'll even maybe pose some questions beyond that. We chose to focus on the Missouri Compromise this year because, as Dr. Schoaf already said, this year is the 200th anniversary of its passing. And this compromise not only paved the way for Missouri statehood in 1821, but it also fueled debates over slavery and property rights that still are affecting us in 2020. So what I want to do today is go through some background on the Missouri Compromise, talk about its immediate effects, its long-term effects in the 19th century, and then get into some of the constitutional long-term questions and legacies that it leaves. And the thing about the Missouri Compromise is that even though it's an act of Congress, it actually pulls on a lot of different components of the Constitution. So let's start, if my clicker will work, yes, with some background information. Missouri became a part of the United States, or I should say the area that we recognize now as the state of Missouri, became a part of the United States when Thomas Jefferson's administration acquired that land from France in the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And you can see the whole map of the Louisiana Purchase as the United States perceived it to exist in 1803, 1804. This is land that the U.S. believes it controls. This is land that France and Spain and Britain also agree belongs to the U.S. The people who actually live there, different members of different indigenous tribes, think that they own the land because they do actually occupy it and control it. So keep that in mind in the background anytime we're talking about the Louisiana Purchase. But this is what it looks like on a map drawn by the U.S. So over the next few years after the Louisiana Purchase, Congress divides parts of the purchase into territories. And the Missouri Territory is officially organized in 1812. Its name is switched to Missouri to distinguish it from the state of Louisiana, which you can see in pink is added at the bottom. I have extra help, apparently. That's all right. What does it mean for a territory to be organized? This is back to, History 110 kind of stuff. In a nutshell, a territory is organized when Congress has appointed a territorial governor who can begin the process of organizing lands into counties that can be settled. So a surveying process and a governing process. The longest serving of Missouri's territorial governors and the most influential was a guy named William Clark. He served from 1813 to 1831, and his name may be familiar to you because he is in fact William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition, that expedition that explored the Louisiana Territory for the United States from 1804 to 1806. William Clark was not perfect by any means, but he was actually fairly adept at managing relations between the white settlers, the Americans who were crossing the Mississippi and coming into Missouri to settle it, and indigenous peoples like the Osage who already lived in the region. The thing to remember about the settlement of Missouri is that a lot of the white Americans who came to the Missouri Territory came basically directly west from their homes in Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Those are all southern slaveholding states. So you guys are, most of you from Missouri, or you're at least familiar with this state. And if you've traveled around, you know that Missouri's geography is pretty varied, right? So we live in Joplin, at least you do while you're in school. We're at the edge of the Ozarks and the Osage Plains. But you guys know if you go toward I-70, you will hit the Missouri River. And the Missouri River is surrounded by incredibly fertile farmland. You also know that if you go all the way east across Highway 60, you can eventually end up in the Boot Hill in the southeast. You're along the Mississippi River, and again, you've got really, really fertile farmland. The soil along the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers is really well suited for growing cotton and hemp. And these were two highly lucrative cash crops in the 19th century, especially cotton. So those immigrants who came from Virginia, from Kentucky, from Tennessee, they are often moving to Missouri in hopes of going to the Missouri River Basin or going to the Boot Hill to establish a cotton plantation. They are hoping to get rich, to become the large planters that they couldn't become in Kentucky or Virginia. So when these planters moved to Missouri, they brought enslaved laborers with them. And once they arrived in Missouri, they continued to buy enslaved people as their wealth increased. So it's important to remember when you're thinking about Missouri's history that slavery existed in Missouri from the time the territory was organized for settlement by the United States. And in fact, we can look back even further and know that slavery existed as soon as the French settlers settled in Illinois country around St. Louis. So slavery has an incredibly long history in the Missouri Territory. So the way that territorial organization works in the United States is that once a territory has 60,000 inhabitants, that territory can apply for statehood. They send a petition to Congress asking Congress for permission to be admitted into the Union and to draft a state constitution. In 1818, Missouri had enough settlers for its territorial legislature to petition Congress for statehood. And Congress's power to add new states from Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1 of the Constitution. So there's our first place where the Constitution and Missouri are coming together. The problem was that Missouri had slavery. So when Missourians petitioned to become a state, congressmen from northern states balked at adding Missouri as another slave state. Basically, even by 1818, the conflict over slavery in the United States was already heated. It was already a sectional issue. New slave states in the Deep South had been added after the War of 1812. Cotton plantations and slavery were spreading as a result. And there were increasing numbers of Northerners and Northern congressmen who were absolutely uneasy with the spread. Not necessarily because they're abolitionists, but because they believed that slavery challenged small white farmers and challenged democracy. Congress had used its power over the territories to ban slavery before. Before the Constitution was ratified with the Northwest Ordinance of 1788, which actually Congress did under the Articles of Confederation, which predates the Constitution, Congress had banned slavery in the future states of the Midwest. So the reason there was no slavery north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi River in that Midwestern region is because Congress had said in 1788 that there wouldn't be. So Congress has already said it has power to decide if there's slavery in the territories. So when it came to Missouri's admission to the Union as a state, a New York congressman named James Talmadge decided to intervene in the issue of slavery in Missouri. He did this by adding an amendment to the approval of Missouri statehood. It has two stipulations. The first stipulation of Talmadge's amendment is that it prohibited more slaves from being imported or brought into Missouri. And the second stipulation is that it required all enslaved people born after statehood to be freed when they turned 25. In other words, this amendment implements gradual emancipation to phase out slavery in Missouri. It passes in the House of Representatives, which has more Northern congressmen than Southern congressmen, but it fails in the Senate because the Senate is balanced between free state and slave state. And this deadlock in Congress was only resolved with this compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise. There are two components to the Missouri Compromise. The first is that Missouri is admitted as a slave state without the Talmadge Amendment, but Maine in the Northeast was admitted as a free state. This keeps the balance of free and slave states in the Union and keeps the Senate balanced. But the second portion of the compromise, and this is the one whose legacy is longer lasting in some ways, the compromise divides the remaining portions of the Missouri Territory that are not included in the state of Missouri along the 3630 parallel. And all areas north of this line of latitude were to be free of slavery. So if you look at this map, and I don't want to move too far away from the microphone because of people joining us on Zoom. But you can see that 3630 line. It's actually just about 20 miles south of us here in Joplin. It runs that southern border between Missouri and Arkansas. So below it is Arkansas Territory, which is open to slavery and also being used for Indian removal. But above it, everything that remains unorganized, Congress says is going to be free. So Congress has conceded Missouri to slavery in 1820, but like it had done with the Northwest Ordinance under those Articles of Confederation, Congress has used its authority, or the authority it believes it has under the Constitution, to prohibit slavery in a huge chunk of federal land. After the compromise, the unorganized territory of the Louisiana Purchase was not open for settlement. You cannot, as an American citizen, you could not move into unorganized territory without a territorial government. That's illegal. If you've ever watched the TV show or the movie Deadwood, that it's fictional mostly, but it plays on this notion of people moving illegally into territories that are unorganized. Parts of this territory, large parts of it, are used for reservations for displaced Native Americans. Other parts of the territory, as I said before, are still controlled by indigenous people. So while white settlers are traveling through the territory, they're using that overland trail to get to Oregon or Utah or California. They are settling Texas and Western territories, which would subsequently be organized. The Great Plains is remaining unorganized. So what's going on? Basically, the question over slavery is continuing to cause tensions in the 1830s, 1840s, and Congress is still fighting over how to balance the interests of free and slave states. In fact, after the Mexican-American War in 1848, Congress fought so bitterly over what to do with the vast territory conquered from Mexico that the US almost devolved into civil war. Another compromise, this time the Compromise of 1850, held the country together by introducing a new concept, at least as far as slavery was concerned. This is called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, which is his own, I guess, kettle of fish, is the notion that the people who lived in a territory, not Congress, would get to decide whether or not slavery was legal. So popular sovereignty works for the new states being added in the West. So you can see on this map the way that the United States is moving around and organizing around that unorganized territory from the Louisiana Purchase. You can see that Texas is added as a state, California is added as a state, and you can see other territories that are organized for settlement. They are all based on the notion, organized on the notion of popular sovereignty, more or less. They preserve that balance, mostly, of free and slave states. And it's not completely palatable to all Americans. There are still tensions, but Congress is able to avoid war with this notion of popular sovereignty. But no one dares touch the Great Plains, that area of the Louisiana Purchase that is supposed to be free, according to the Missouri Compromise, as soon as it's organized for settlement. That is, until a senator from Illinois decided to raise the issue of organizing this territory so that he could build a transcontinental railroad that connected his home state with California. This senator was named Stephen Douglas. You can see why he has an interest in Nebraska. Americans were debating whether they should build their railroad in the South or in the North. Obviously, Chicago and the state of Illinois benefit from a transcontinental railroad that runs from Illinois to California. But to build a railroad, you've got to have organized territory. So Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act, which passed in 1854, divided this unorganized territory into two territories, one called Kansas and one called Nebraska. The act also repealed the Missouri Compromise and replaced it with popular sovereignty. Douglas is thinking basically that this would preserve the balance of free and slave states by admitting one of each. He just naturally assumed Kansas would become a slave state because it parallels Missouri, and then Nebraska would be admitted as a free state eventually. But this act touched off a national controversy over slavery. It led to bloody fighting in Kansas. So essentially, we have a situation where Congress is trying to control slavery, and instead, the crisis is spinning out of control. 3 years later, the Supreme Court decides to weigh in as well. They do this with their Dred Scott decision, also based in Missouri, which they rendered in 1857. The backstory is this, in a nutshell. An enslaved man named Dred Scott was taken from Missouri with his master to live in Illinois, which was a free state, and then to live in the Wisconsin Territory, which was a free territory. And he lived in the free state and the free territory for several years before returning to Missouri with his slaveholder. When Scott returned to Missouri, he sued for his freedom. He argued that he became free when he resided in states and territories where slavery was illegal. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which in a 7-2 decision ruled that Dred Scott was still a slave. The Chief Justice, Roger Taney, issued the decision. He said the Missouri law took precedent over Illinois or Wisconsin, though Scott was still a slave. But he went farther. He said African Americans were not citizens. He says, in fact, they have no rights that white people are bound to respect. And because they're not citizens, they have no right to petition the court in the first place. But he keeps going. Taney decides to go ahead and weigh into the slavery issue itself. And Taney says that the Missouri Compromise, furthermore, is unconstitutional because Congress had no power to ban slavery in any territory of the U.S. Taney argued basically that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it violated the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. Enslaved people, legally, were the chattel or property of their owners. And the Fifth Amendment to the Bill of Rights argues that U.S. citizens cannot be deprived of their property without due process of law. So Taney concludes basically that by not allowing white people to move into territories anywhere in the United States with their property, Congress was violating the Fifth Amendment, depriving them of their property simply because they crossed the state line. Taney's decision in Dred Scott was hailed by white Southerners and absolutely decried by Northerners, because what it seems to do is pave the way for slavery to spread throughout the United States, which was the opposite of what many Northerners wanted. And Taney's belief that Black people are primarily property, this was widespread, not just among white Southerners, but also among many Northerners. And in fact, even some abolitionists believed that the Constitution protected slavery because of its protections of property rights. They actually wanted to get rid of the Constitution because they believed it made a pact with the devil. So they're not in favor of this notion, but there are abolitionists who believe that the Constitution protects slavery because it protects property. But Frederick Douglass, another abolitionist, also weighs in to this constitutional debate about property that consumed Americans in those years following the Missouri Compromise's repeal. As Douglass saw it, no man is guaranteed a right of property in man in the Constitution. In fact, it was only by interpreting the Constitution in the light of its secret understanding that the Fifth Amendment could be twisted to argue that Black people were property rather than human beings. Quite oppositely, Douglass pointed out, the Constitution forbade the passing of a bill of attainder. That is, a law entailing upon the child the disabilities and hardships imposed upon the parent. That's in Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 3. In other words, state laws that stipulated that slavery was passed from mother to child, which means slavery was inherited, were unconstitutional. So in 2020, we are 200 years removed from the Missouri Compromise. And of course, that Dred Scott decision that repealed the compromise has long since been decried. And its provision that Black people were not citizens was voided by the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which secures citizenship for all people born in the United States. But the legacy of the Missouri Compromise and the Dred Scott decision should give us pause. Because the weighing of white people's property against Black people's humanity did not magically end in 1868 with the passing of the 14th Amendment. And so when we think about events over the course of the 20th century, when we think of those of our own time, of Black Lives Matter, related movements for civil rights, when we hear conversations about property, people's lives, it's important to remember that historically, property has been given more weight than the lives of human beings whose skin was Black. And we are left, I think, in 2020 to fix the damage of that. We'll now, I think, switch to a panel so that you all can ask questions. I thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Bever. I think you set us up to have a lively conversation here. We're going to welcome now to the panel Mr. Brendan Higashi, Master Instructor of Political Science and expert in the American judicial system. Dr. William Montz, Adjunct Professor of History who focuses on modern American history, foreign relations with an emphasis in race and empire. And Dr. Willem Delahanty, Associate Professor of Political Science who specializes in political theory and American politics. And so I know the panelists are anxious to weigh in, and please, everyone, both those of you watching us on Zoom and those of you here in the room with us, please don't hesitate if you have questions that you'd like the panel to address.
Testing. Hello. Okay.
Which one did it?
It's fine. I'll leave that off.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, if it's okay, I may start with just a response to Professor Bever's comments. I don't know if my mic is being too much right now. Thank you again, Professor Shell, for organizing this. Do you think we should just pass one mic? Or? No, okay. All right. Well, hopefully y'all can hear me. I'll try and speak up until we get the mic back. As Professor Bever has neatly pointed out, the problems of our time are rooted in our history, and to be more precise, in the historical documents such as the Constitution and ensuing jurisprudence and legislation that has literally shaped our nation, and in this case, very specifically, our state. Indeed, when I was asked to participate in this event, what excited me most was not having the opportunity to discuss the actual Constitution itself, but the spirit in which our founding fathers wrote it, a Republican spirit. As the historian Jill Lepore reminds us, our founding fathers believed wise laws, robust institutions, and even a constitution would not be enough on their own for the Republic to succeed. Civic virtue, Republican virtue, was the secret sauce that would make the system work. This devotion to the common welfare, or res publica, as the founding fathers referred to it, placed equality over liberty. Indeed, without equality, the idea all men and women were born equal and not into the vestiges of some feudalistic system in which they were preordained to remain their entire life, there could be no liberty. So in America, as our definition of equality has become more inclusive, it undoubtedly begs us not to make the same mistakes as our predecessors, sacrificing our belief in human equality at the expense of personal liberty. Or as Professor Bever has so well worded it on this Constitution Day, not to quote, weigh people's property against people's humanity.
I'd like to also thank Dr. Bever for her talk. I come at this issue from the position of a political scientist who primarily studies judicial politics and teaches constitutional law. And I think the one thing that is really important to take away from this is the extent to which our Constitution both serves as a tool to restrain government action, but also becomes the vehicle by which we legitimize what it is our government does. And so the Constitution isn't just necessarily a text that sits in the National Archives and is the process that we follow for passing laws, but the Constitution becomes a way for us to, through its reinterpretation, to shape government and society in ways that are convenient for the politics of the time. Some of you are in my constitutional law class right now, and you'll know one of the things I constantly stress is the way we interpret law, the way we consider our legal issues is not something that just develops in a vacuum. The politics of the time inherently shape the law, and much like what Dr. Bever has pointed out, the politics of the Missouri Compromise and the organization of the territories and the territories of the United States have long-lasting implications for how government moves forward. Even through the processes of adopting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we still see significant legal resistance to the full promises made in these particular amendments today. We to this day see provisions of the 14th Amendment, like the privileges and immunities clauses, interpreted in the narrowest ways possible, forcing courts to turn to other provisions that were never intended to protect civil rights and civil liberties in order to be the basis of the foundations for the laws that prevent discrimination or protect voting rights. And so it's important for us to consider the ways in which many of these early political discussions continue to shape our current interpretations of our Constitution.
Saying this without making it squeal. I would like to echo my colleagues and kind of thank Dr. Bever also for, I think, a really insightful kind of discussion on the Missouri Compromise. One question that maybe I don't know if we're supposed to ask questions or maybe try to create some discussion. Dr. Mounts, you had mentioned kind of republicanism, right, as kind of in part, right, a view of the citizens' relation to their government and society. To what degree might you also argue that, at least, and Dr. Bever, you can weigh in as well, that we have a liberal society, one that values property, right, the ability to own and distribute things, but then also at the same time has to have some kind of underlying conceptions of equal persons and, right, the ability to own and kind of possess that property. So I kind of be interested to see what you both think.
You want to go first? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think in so many ways, republicanism and liberalism sometimes end up, I mean, maybe in Thomas Jefferson's mind, they're supposed to complement each other, but I think they end up in tension with each other because a Republican society does require that you put the common good ahead of individual pursuits at times, but liberalism teaches us that, you know, this pursuit of private property and the protection of it is okay. And I think we're programmed to think that it's okay, and we're programmed to value our stuff and our land, and have been for 200 years. So I think the ideas end up, I guess, beating each other. And my sense is that in some ways, at least for the 19th century, and you could speak more to the 20th, liberalism sometimes seems to win out when it's pitted against republicanism.
Oh, I would definitely agree with that. By the 20th century, liberalism, the idea of protecting property, especially through corporate charter, that comes into being. Speaking of misuse of amendments, definitely wins out. I have a quote here from John Adams, though, that I think if we were following the Republican spirit, that really the idea of property and property must submit to that Republican virtue still, because without it, then you lose the whole republic that would, you know, ensure those rights. Here we have from John Adams and his report of a constitution on form of government for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which he wrote in October 1779. Government is instituted for the common good, for the protection, safety, prosperity, and happiness of the people, and not for the profit honor, or private interest of any one man, family, or even class of men. Therefore, the people alone have an incontestable, unalienable, and indivisible right to institute government and to reform, alter, or totally change the same when their protection, safety, prosperity, and happiness require it. And this quote obviously leads to a larger discussion, but I think it kind of addresses your question to some extent, Professor Delahunty.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't want to dominate here, but is Adam speaking from a privileged position in the sense of being from a particular sort of group with resources, et cetera, you think?
I'll take that. And Adams speaks not only to a point of exceptional privilege, but Adams is also advancing a Republican form of government designed inherently to protect individual liberalistic rights. And while he advances a Republican idea or sense of government for the common good, that rhetoric is also largely employed as a means of distancing ourselves from Great Britain. And the result of that, in particular, is a call for the people of the newly freed states to determine their own governmental structures. But Adams very much was opposed to universal white male suffrage and allowing even unlanded white men from voting. He very much opposed the idea that people with significant amount of debt should be able to vote. And he opposed granting participation in government to even his own wife, who repeatedly wrote him asking him and the other members of the Constitutional Convention to remember the women and to allow women the right to vote from the outset. And so as much as there's this belief in a government for the common good, part of the common good was the protection of individual property rights, because if you let people who don't meet freehold qualifications or don't meet the requirements of holding a minimum amount of land, being debt-free, and a free adult white man the franchise, the ability to vote, what's the natural consequence? Well, people without land will vote to take away everyone else's land, or at least that was the common belief at the time. And so Republican government was just as much about protecting property at that time as it was about promoting the common good.
Yeah, I would like to also respond that, you know, maybe it's kind of old school, but when I give the lecture on the Constitution, I've always described it as a conservative document, kind of putting the democratic genie back into the bottle, so to speak, after the revolution. When I said I was, you know, excited to speak on Constitution Day, part of the reason I was excited was talking spirit and kind of the aspirational ideals that were espoused. The actual document itself, especially if you're a firm believer in democracy like I am, was actually very prohibitive. There's only one part of one branch of government that the people will directly elect when the Constitution is written, and that's the House of Representatives. Every other part of it was, you know, distance from the people, the tyranny of the people, so to speak. And so I think it speaks to Professor Higash's, yes, that we have to be careful exactly what we aspire to when we look back at this period.
We have a moderator. Do you guys have questions? Go for it.
So, if I recall correctly, basically the Dred Scott is one of the major points in the forward election. One of the issues that was discussed during that. And since it has, that's pretty much affected by the existence of the very compromised being as it's appealing, wouldn't you say the very compromised had a major effect on my election?
I mean, I think oh yeah, so she's asking essentially, because Dred Scott then plays into the 1860 presidential election, So does then that could we basically argue that then the repeal of the Missouri Compromise affects that 1860 presidential election? And I would argue absolutely, because essentially what happens is we leave Dred Scott with Northerners being worried that the Supreme Court has paved the way for slavery to be made legal throughout the United States. And so specifically when Stephen Douglas is campaigning for the Democratic nominee or nomination, he is asked by Northerners, Midwesterners particularly, like, doesn't Dred Scott, isn't it going to mean that we have to have slavery in our state and we don't want it? And Douglas says, no, not really. You would only have slavery in your state if you made a slave code. So any state that doesn't want slavery can avoid becoming a slave state by simply not making a slave code. And if you don't have a slave code, nobody's going to move there with their slaves. This is called his Freeport Doctrine. That then prompts Southern Democrats to demand that the National Democratic Party adopt a federal slave code, essentially adopt slavery nationally, and legalize it nationally as a part of their 1860 platform. And it leads to a schism in the Democratic Party. Ultimately, it leads to Northern Democrats nominating the Stephen Douglas and Southern Democrats breaking up and nominating John Breckinridge. So yeah, it has a huge effect.
Maybe Professor Higashi or Professor Delahanty can answer this. I didn't even know all that. So, but one of the things that I think maybe also you're asking is, the Supreme Court making a ruling, knowing directly that it could affect the outcome of an election, and in Tani's position on that. And we're kind of in the spirit today that the Supreme Court probably shouldn't do that. I don't know how y'all feel about that.
There's a principle in constitutional law that whenever possible, a court, not just the Supreme Court, but any court, once it answers the narrowest question possible, if that's enough to dispose of all other questions, you should not proceed to all other questions. And in the Dred Scott decision, presumably, once the question was answered as to whether or not, so the question that was not necessarily contested was that return to Missouri returned Dred Scott to a status of slavery, even if he had been freed by his sojourns in Wisconsin and Illinois. The Supreme Court comes to the question, well, does a slave have standing to sue in federal court? Presumably, having answered no to that question, that should have been the end of the case. Roger Taney deciding, and having seen the issues of bleeding Kansas and the threats of civil war after the first attempt at a Republican presidential bid occurs, decides that he's going to Dred Scott take slavery off the legislative agenda altogether. Taney believes that by overturning the Missouri Compromise, we no longer have to have congressional discussions or legislative discussions on the issue of slavery. It will be settled, it will allow for the popular sovereignty to occur, and as states are admitted, they get to decide. The problem for Taney is that Abraham Lincoln directly takes up the mantle of what becomes known as the radical wing of the Republican Party, advocates against the Dred Scott decision and the idea that freed African Americans could never be citizens, which is part of Taney's ruling. And Abraham Lincoln ultimately wins 40% of the popular vote, but an overwhelming majority in the Electoral College, which then triggers civil war. So Roger Taney's entire decision to preserve the intent to preserve the Union and prevent the civil wars that almost occurred over the admission of Texas and the bleeding Kansas disputes, in effect, lead directly to the events that lead up to the Civil War and Southern secession. So Taney, trying to be perhaps altruistic in his sense and preserve the Union, broke it. for lack of a better phrase.
But also saying this too, I mean, courts are political institutions just like they are
Yes.
legal ones. And so to think that the courts could operate independent of a political context where they know that their rulings are going to have, right, these significant political effects, I mean, it makes them very interesting. I mean, you look at, not just in the 19th century, but into the 20th and the 21st century, you see repeatedly the Supreme Court making decisions that, as you were kind of suggesting, are maybe decided maybe on narrow constitutional or legal grounds, but nevertheless have wide scale, right, and significant political effect.
Of course.
Yeah.
We see it with segregation in schools. When we first attempted to desegregate schools, the concern was, well, we're going to have to determine boundaries between which students go to which schools. Well, you've had a history of, even in states with normal segregation, you have a history of de facto segregation where banks actively discourage or are discouraged or themselves discouraging loans to families of color to purchase homes in white neighborhoods. Realtors associations threaten to revoke licenses for realtors who take any action that would devalue property, one of which would be allowing a family of color to move into a particular area. That is a traditionally white neighborhood. And part of this was gatekeeping schools because we assess and we fund schools widely throughout the United States using property tax values. So the higher your property tax value, the more funds that go to schools in particular areas, and schools with lower property tax values get less money. The part of that is very much a race decision based off property rights and rulings that stem back to the legacies of the Civil War and the legacies of the Missouri Compromise.
Nick, did you have a question?
So you mentioned that the argument is that free states do not have to have that because free states have to allow stakeholders to come to the and that kind of
Yeah. Yeah, it's not really a strong argument. I think Douglas is desperate for Northern voters because the Republican Party is, gaining a lot of steam. There's already a fugitive slave law of 1850 that lets Southerners, it's national, and it lets Southerners, chase perceived runaways, and it puts the burden of proof on African Americans. You have to prove that you're not a runaway, or the courts just assume you are. And yeah, there's nothing that will seize enslaved people who say come with their families, not their families, who come with the families who own them. Let me say that carefully. To vacation on Cape Cod. The only thing basically that Massachusetts would be able to do is maybe prevent people from permanently settling there. The idea is that slaveholders would voluntarily decide that maybe it's not the best idea to live in Massachusetts because they're not going to really protect my property in that sense. But yeah, there are plenty of Northerners that aren't really convinced by the Freeport Doctrine. It's just that it freaks out white Southerners and makes them more radical.
I'm going to break in here. So we got a question on Zoom. We have a question about the 13th Amendment. Does the 13th Amendment perpetuate slavery and an involuntary servitude in the context of those who have been convicted of a crime?
Yes. The 13th Amendment quite clearly states that it abolishes conditions of involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. So the exception there being that that if you are convicted of a crime as part of your prison sentence, you can be essentially a forced laborer for the state. It is a quite clear exception in the 13th Amendment, and it's explicit in the actual text.
I guess we might also add that the consequences of that, as hopefully many of you know, were dire. We think about convict labor in the New South, and the consequences and legacy of that even through today. It's an excellent documentary on Netflix right now called 13th, which details and outlines that.
So then the 13th Amendment just be said to be like private recreation rather than just keeping it to privatized ownership of other entities rather than public, or does the presence of private persons count as
That's a hard question.
Yeah.
Can we summarize that question?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, but-
No, go for it.
Mary, are you saying that the 13th Amendment allows for, right, the use of labor in a private setting versus, say, a public one?
the idea goes that the 13th Amendment allows slavery at a governmental level and government facilities as a part of a punishment. That means that the government does not live on slave labor. However, they, on another hand, legalize privatized ownership of MSSU because outside the government context, as a part of punishment, count as MSSU. However, does the presence of a private prison privately by a corporation challenge the notion that a private individual can, or does their presence as a quasi-government?
So your question basically is, do private prisons potentially violate the 13th Amendment because they are a private ownership of slavery?
Yeah.
That's a hard question.
Yeah.
I mean, they're contracted by the state and federal governments, which makes it, as you pointed out, like a quasi-state function. So I'm not a legal expert. I would say the bigger problem, right, is that the federal government and the state governments are still allowed to use forced labor, right? That's yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question.
And I don't know if it's a good answer. I think generally speaking, courts might, and again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not as I like to kind of joke, I've never played one on television. But my guess would be is even if the somebody, if a state or the federal government is using private prisons as contractors for prison services, that may not necessarily constitute private ownership per se. The person is still serving a prison sentence owed to the state or to the community or to the government. So as far as labor is concerned, it might be simply presumed to be of the state to which at best somebody is contracted out. But it's I would say it's an ongoing legal issue that I don't know of a court case that addresses that question off the top of my head now.
And then I guess my counter to that necessarily would be that those private prisons lobby the government for more strict judicial rules. So if those private prisons are working under government, under the offices of government labor, then how can they then lobby the government for more strict laws in prison? If they're essentially supposed to be a government.
Well, I mean, as private organizations, they still have interests different than the governments that they would contract with.
And that's kind of the greater issue that I'm trying to figure out. Privatization still exists.
Right. I mean,
Absolutely.
yeah, I mean, the other thing too that you're kind of hitting on a little bit is the notion of the fact that we can talk about owning other people's labor, right? So
Yeah.
I think in the 19th century, this debate between free versus slave labor is kind of an underlying, right, source of I mean, it's a conflict. It seems like Northerners, for example, resist slavery because they worry about how it impacts white free labor.
Right.
And so, Nick, I think maybe your question deals in some ways with that too, right? I mean, how can private or governmental agencies own and therefore profit from or take resources from, right, those that are imprisoned or otherwise controlled by others?
Right.
Good question.
Well, I think too, it's just, I mean, I think private prisons are the latest iteration of basically people with some kind of profit benefit from somebody else's forced labor, using their influence, whatever level of government they have. You know, I mean, they're lobbying at the federal or the state level, but is that really different than, you know, white Southerners making laws in the 1870s that say, well, it's a crime now to walk down the street, you know, without a sticker from your employer or whatever, and just like tossing people, you know, back on plantations. It seems like the same sort of thing, right? That people use their influence legally to create a system where there are conveniently, for their bottom line, more forced laborers.
I would like to say, Nick, I think I think that Professor Sagasti and Delahanty have kind of addressed what you're asking, but I love that, you know, that line of questioning. For example, when Thurgood Marshall was trying to overturn segregation, he had to get very creative in how to sneak through the cracks of that law. And so he had this smart idea, well, I'm not going to go after all schools, just going to focus on higher education because clearly states don't have the money to offer professional and graduate degrees equally to African American students. And with that small, you know, little crack was a starting place for him to start building suit. And so, you know, if you're going to challenge things, especially constitutionally, they take time and they take those sort of probing questions to get at those issues.
I'm going to interrupt here real quick. I need to start bringing the mic out to you all. The people on Zoom can't hear your excellent questions. And we have a follow-up question. They're asking, in the panel's opinion, should that exception for involuntary servitude from the 13th Amendment be extended out and the idea of community service done away with?
So just to kind of maybe clarify then, is the question, people should be forced to labor and they shouldn't be allowed to kind of work in a community context? Is that kind of what?
So like compulsory community service for as like your punishment for a crime.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that currently exists though.
Yes.
Yes, I think they're asking,
Oh,
should
sorry.
should it not be allowed?
Well, these are really thought-provoking. I mean, they're really challenging questions, and I think they're questions that, like, we as citizens and you guys as, you know, as students, as you graduate and you start voting, I think these are really serious policy questions that need addressing, that, as we're pointing out, haven't been addressed in the court systems maybe as much as they should have been. But yeah, I think just like the question of privatized prisons and using people's labor when they're incarcerated, you know, I think community service is, I think that's another issue that potentially falls under this. It is forcing someone to do labor as penance for a crime. I think most people would prefer community service, you know, over incarceration, but it still is coercive. So I think, you know, I don't have a definitive policy answer, but I do think it's something that warrants discussion.
And I'd agree with that. I don't know that I would go so far as to say that, you know, community service is something we should prohibit. Should we appeal or repeal that provision of the 13th Amendment? I think the more pressing policy issues are questions related to the West Coast states' use of prison population for to fight the fires. California, in particular, has a massive population of prison firefighters who can't, after release, pass a background check to actually get a job as a firefighter because they are a convicted felon. And the state recently passed a law to make it easier for people convicted of felonies, but there are so many exceptions to it that it only affects a small number of those people who are prison firefighters, as it is. We see significant use of that exception for the 13th Amendment on state legislative and governor's mansion grounds. The state of Louisiana in particular has a ton of individuals who are in prison who staff pretty much the entirety of custodial and cafeteria services for the state legislature and the state governor's mansion, and it's considered the good jobs that you could get. They do groundskeeping for the legislative buildings for the governor's mansions as well. And it's not unique to Louisiana. Washington State, where I was raised, has a program in which women who are in the women's prison decorate the governor's mansion for the holidays as part of a skills building program related to it's not technically being like teaching them to be florists, but there's a arborist program or something like that that members of the women's prison who are qualified can go decorate the governor's mansion. And these are questions that arise under that 13th Amendment exception to slavery. At what point do even work programs that are designed to teach the incarcerated individuals new skills and then provide very cheap labor in doing so benefit that? I mean, I think Nebraska or Kansas has a similar program that in which they were partnering with airline manufacturers to teach people how to make airplane parts. But then because these airplane manufacturers have federal contracts which require them to not employ felons, the people that they are training to build airplane parts cannot get jobs at these companies that train them after release because those companies have federal contracts that prohibit the employment of felons. So it's a cycle that just perpetuates the poverty and defeats the purposes of these skills building programs in many instances.
Thank you. I was surprised to learn myself when I learned that Missouri sundown towns had lasted fairly long. And so I was wondering to what extent have we seen an effect of sundown towns today here in Missouri? Or if we still do.
Yeah, that's a hard question. I'm not a 20th century historian, so sundown towns are something, I'm not trying to cop out here. Sundown towns are something that happens after the periods I study. So I know about them, but I don't know, I don't always know specifically where they're at. I know Missouri has them. For those of you who might not be aware, a sundown town basically is a town that has some kind of understanding that Black people are not allowed to live there, that they can perhaps work there, but they should be out of town by a certain time of day, by sundown, or they risk being killed. And they're pretty pervasive in the Midwest and in other parts of the United States. They're not just a Southern phenomenon. I think there's no question it shapes economic development of states. It makes, in the 20th century, sundown towns make African Americans much more likely, when they're migrating out of the South looking for work, they're much more likely to migrate to larger cities. I mean, there are more jobs there, but there are also maybe smaller chances of being violently repressed. Joplin's history certainly whether it's officially a sundown town or not. There was a lynching in the early 20th century that drove African Americans out of the city. They didn't come back for generations. So it's basically violence that prevents African Americans from essentially participating in this liberal society, which is where where we started talking, that prevents them from getting a job and getting a house in a city that might be economically beneficial to them. And it certainly has long-term effects on middling and smaller communities within states.
The other thing too, to kind of go off a little bit on what Dr. Bever was saying, it is kind of interesting that cities, municipalities could have kind of implicit assumptions that certain groups in their population can be controlled or otherwise limited in their mobility, right, in their movement, in a way that, obviously is discriminatory. And so I guess one of the things that's kind of interesting in thinking kind of contemporary politics about the degree to which municipalities, states, and the federal government reproduce that same kind of activity, which is to control, modify, or otherwise limit, right, the movement of certain groups of people, including Black people, African Americans, and American society. I mean, so taking that, the question that you're raising, and then kind of thinking about, at a much bigger level, does our society have those implicit assumptions that our governments and agents of control can limit and otherwise stop certain people from moving or otherwise doing what they want to do?
Yeah, and I think another part, and Professor Bever mentioned this, there's a new book by James Lowen. I think it might be called Sundown Towns.
Mm-hmm.
It's been sitting on my shelf staring at me. I haven't read it just yet, but I think it might answer some of your questions. But thinking about it from an economic perspective, especially when we look at the creation of inner city ghettos, we claim to believe in a laissez-faire system where people can follow jobs in a market, follow the pursuit of happiness, so to speak. And yet here we are providing limits to those market forces, forcing people into certain geographical areas. And so when we think of these laws actually, constructing and limiting the market that was supposed to, as a liberal society, are supposed to be praising and saying, oh, everyone should be able to follow the market forces for their own well-being. This should raise some serious pause about how all these ideas are supposed to work together, and if they can do unparadoxically. And if they can't unparadoxically, what does that mean?
One of the ways I think some of these implicit assumptions kind of become more pervasive is to recognize that in many instances they are not explicitly ever sanctioned by government. After the end of Reconstruction beginning in around 1900, Southern states in particular began adopting literacy tests and grandfather clauses to exclude individuals from voting. During the Reconstruction period, African Americans in many states were registering to vote and voted in rates that their turnout far outstripped that of white Americans. And immediately after the end of Reconstruction, states begin to tamp down on that. And they do so in official manners by requiring that you pass a literacy test, which were designed to give discretion to the test administrator to fail you for any reason. But while those were the official side of voter suppression, the unofficial side was that anybody who showed up to take a literacy test who wasn't white was reported to a citizens committee. And that citizens committee, more often than not, was staffed by members of the Ku Klux Klan, who then went out and either intimidated you out of voting or trying again, or in worst case instances, lynched you for trying and then discouraged other people from having tried to apply for these. And these implicit or unofficial, unsanctioned methods of suppression feed into that discussion. But it's not just things like those citizens councils either. Banks wouldn't give loans to people if they wanted to move into historically white neighborhoods. There's a great book called Color of Law that delves into the fact that city maps were often broken into different communities, and the entire idea that somebody would live on the wrong side of the railroad tracks was an implication that somebody lived in a ethnic ghetto area of a particular part of town that white people should avoid. Even cities that were far outside the South or didn't have de jure segregation engaged in this. The City of Seattle Realtors Association for a long time had an ethics, a part of its code of ethics that said if you took knowing action as a realtor to devalue, that would cause the devaluation of property, you would lose your license. One such thing was to knowingly allow a family of color to move into a white neighborhood. And so we see the ramifications of this and that sundown town mentality that are often unofficial as part of that. You also have homeowners association contracts, which until the 1980s were allowed to include provisions that made it that voided the sale of the house if you attempted to sell the home to a family of color. They actually wrote that into your contracts to make sure that you could never, that individual homes in those associations stayed white and kept neighborhoods white. And so it's often not about state power. And it was only when courts said we're not going to enforce those clauses anymore that we see that transition.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. So I hope the panel doesn't mind, but I'd like to bring the discussion towards more contemporary events looking at the Black Lives Matter movement. So as I sort of spoke with some of my colleagues earlier, I have a high school education of the Missouri Compromise. So some of these things have been brought up today, have been enlightening and sort of sparking some thoughts. So the discussion over property versus person. So in response to a lot of these, whether we call them protests or riots, depending on our side of the view of this, it seems that oftentimes the importance of protecting property outweighs protecting certain lives of color perhaps. That's largely what this movement is about in some ways. Could the panel speak to this a little bit in a sort of more modern sense?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's because I view everything kind of through a lens of the 19th century, but I absolutely draw connections between the sort of cries over property destruction in modern, in the Black Lives Movement with 19th century and slavery. And I mean, I think there are two things going on. I think on the one hand, Americans are programmed, especially white Americans are programmed, and it have been for, nearly 300 years, to value property and clutch it, among everything, so that we are just horrified when somebody might destroy property. And I think we're also programmed problematically to see Black people as less than. So when we see somebody destroying property, our focus is on the burning building more, I think, unfortunately, than it is on human beings who are dying. But I think there's also like a really strong political statement being made. And I realize that the Black Lives Matter movement, I realize that not all activists in it are monolithic. There are many sort of opinions about what, the proper political targets are. And there always have been in the civil rights movement, different strategies, different tactics. I think there's something profoundly political about attacking property in a nation that has historically considered you property. And when your body couldn't be owned, you were considered, basically, we've been talking about lynch mobs and disfranchisement and not being allowed to live. So a nation who doesn't see your body as being, or your humanity as being worth anything if you can't be owned, it seems then politically powerful to strike at other forms of property, at least for me. I mean, and I know there are myriad opinions about property damage. I think there's a political message there. And I think it is that for, since before the Missouri Compromise, we've been weighing property over Black people's humanity, and maybe the only thing left in some people's minds is to start attacking property to make that point.
And I think it goes, to me, it's even in deeper what I was trying to bring up about the fundamental ideas of equality. You have a group of people that feel like whatever social contract exists with them, between them and their government, is broken, has been broken. Just like we may not think of the founding fathers as violent revolutionaries, but when they felt that their social contract, based on what their natural beliefs were, what they defined as their natural beliefs, had been violated, they too rebelled. And in some cases, destroyed property. Okay, and T, right? So is this not a model for us? That someone like Jefferson, you know, some people take this as a joke, but he suggested every 20 odd years, basically what at the time was nearly every generation, should make their own constitution. And people laugh at it. But to rewrite a constitution that would expand a social contract, answer these kind of very pressing and not only just timely, but beyond time. These questions sadly should have been answered years ago. Leaves us with a lot to ask about our system and our beliefs and where we're going to go forward. And I think that in a lot of ways, for me, as a historian and as a scholar and just as a citizen, this is refreshing. Is it scary? Yes. Sometimes it is. But is it important and significant? Absolutely. And perhaps, dare we say, necessary.
I have 3 questions in the queue here. So I see Nick's hand, but I'm gonna do the queued questions if that's okay. So the first one asks, were African Americans the only race forced into slavery at this time, presumably the 19th century, or were there other races considered slaves as well? So it's kind of weird to ask a question and then answer it, I guess. But I'll say, so by the 19th century, American chattel slavery is predominantly African American. Before the 19th century, in the 17th and 18th century, there were indigenous enslaved people, Native Americans were enslaved by English colonists, by Spanish colonists as well. Those systems of slavery never quite worked the same legally as African chattel slavery. So by really the time of the American Revolution, American society has shifted to enslaving African Americans and codifying that system based on race. That's I guess, the short answer. But yes, there was absolutely indigenous slavery in American history.
Okay, so earlier you guys talked about the separating of neighborhoods and the use of property value to determine schooling. So the best schools were typically white schools as a part of de facto segregation, right? And we also talked, and Dr. Gunderman talked a little bit about having a high school education of the civil rights movement and of issues for people of color and Black individuals. One of those problems were something that I found interesting was I had never learned about Rosewood or the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa. Could you guys speak to the role that education historically and today has in institutionalized racism within the country?
I feel like that's its own sort of panel.
That's a big question.
I mean, I guess one way to think about it is, I mean, insofar as education provides, right, some kind of opportunity or mechanism for advancing and therefore kind of generating wealth and transferring it over time, then education has this kind of mitigating effect. On the other hand, though, to the degree that you're part of a group where your chances of acquiring that education are severely limited, and they have been historically, I think would also suggest that education doesn't become, right, the mechanism of upward mobility for groups of color, people of color that we would think of versus, say, other groups. So I think there is this kind of idea in our society that if you get an education, that you're going to be better off. And that's probably likely true, but we still have to think about, right, the questions of how you get access, and how do we, in fact, give people the opportunity to kind of pursue the education. I mean, there are existing programs currently, like for example, for Native Americans and Native peoples, where governments will provide, right, highly subsidized education as a way to kind of facilitate, right, their greater representation, but it doesn't occur for all groups. So, not to change the subject just for a second, but when Dr. Gunneman asked this question about property and people, one radical response would be something like redistributing property to, in fact, show value of people. That's a fairly strong statement, but I mean, I'm just suggesting that if you do that, it gives fair access to the things that we think are helpful for people's life change.
To be fair, we did try that. In the wake of the Civil War, we passed the Freedmen's Bureau, the first Freedmen's Bureau Act and the second Freedmen's Bureau Act. And one of the hallmarks of the second Freedmen's Bureau Act was that all of this land that was seized from Confederate plantation owners who, by way of rebellion against government, lost rights to property, was to then parcel some of that out for freedmen and their families to start their own farms. And then the Supreme Court said that taking the property away worked as a bill of a writ of attainder, and violated the treason provision of the Constitution, which says the crime of treason shall not work upon corruption of blood, which means that the crimes of the sons are not the crimes of the father, but in this particular instance, by divesting a parent of property that would otherwise be heritable, you were also disinheriting children and affecting their rights to property. And so the Supreme Court invalidated portions of the Freedmen's Bureau's Act and required the restoration of the property to the heirs of many of these plantation owners. So even the idea that a radical redistribution of property could solve some of those problems runs into constitutional barriers when we say we're not allowed to do that because the crime of treason cannot corrupt, or it does not work upon corruption of blood.
But I think Dr. Gunderman is suggesting that there may be a fundamental flaw in the sense that,
yeah,
insofar as my rights limit your personhood and your capacity to be a person and be treated as such, then how can you make any claim on the basis of those rights?
Well, we see the same discussion arise with stand your ground laws and castle doctrine laws.
Mm-hmm.
Missouri has both of those. The rationale behind stand your ground, and in particular castle doctrine. So stand your ground is a doctrine that says you're entitled to self-defense if you believe your person is potentially under threat. And castle doctrine says it's not just your person, but it's your property and your home, and you have a right to defend your home. And so we see that extension where there, under both of these doctrines, particularly the castle doctrine, there is no obligation to attempt to retreat. So generally speaking, when you invoke self-defense, you have to show that you attempted or tried to retreat from the situation, but were unable to do so, and thus violence in self-defense was the last resort. Under states that have a codified castle doctrine, in most instances, you are freed from that obligation to show you attempted retreat, and thereby again privileging protection of an individual's property over necessarily somebody's lives by saying you don't, even when your own life is potentially under threat, you don't have to try and escape first.
I would like to add on the issues of how racial ideas may affect property and Reconstruction. You know, we had lots of territory that could have been divvied out, and in fact was divvied out to larger than California, given to private corporations, most of which were railroad corporations, in the wake of the Civil War. And then to think of that brilliantly, but not think about, oh, well, how could we provide some wealth or independence or property to a group of newly freedmen? You know, the social realities that affect our thinking in that way.
Yeah.
You know?
So I have another question from Zoom. And this question says, the Dred Scott decision did directly address the question of African American citizenship. But the issue also arose earlier at the time of the Missouri Compromise when the proposed Missouri Constitution prohibited free blacks from entering Missouri. Could Dr. Bever or any of the panelists discuss how this issue played out at the time? It is a good question. So I'm actually going to show my ignorance of Missouri state politics, so maybe some political scientists can step in. It's certainly by barring free black immigration to the state, it puts Missouri in line with a lot of other southern and northern states. A lot of southern states were prohibiting manumissions to try to keep their free black populations low. A lot of northern states avoided the issue of black citizenship by, again, barring immigration of black people to their states. I can't speak to Missouri specifically, but obviously to speak to these other issues, it prevents free black people from accessing the opportunities of Missouri that are available to white people. It shapes Missouri society so that everybody who has black skin is enslaved, which then colors the way that people are thought of in Missouri society. In this way, it's no different than other states. But as far as the specifics of like how Missouri ended up demographically, I don't have numbers or certain specifics. I don't know if you guys do.
I don't have specifics for that. Again, I don't specialize in Missouri politics. I'm not from Missouri, so I don't quite have a ton of context for that. But I think one of the things that also kind of plays into this as well is is as we begin to see northern states move towards abolition, at this point in time, we also see the movement to, for lack of a better phrase, potentially repatriate freed African Americans to Africa and the foundation of Liberia under I believe it was Monroe.
31, right? 31, the Colonization Society, I thought. No, it's earlier than that, I'm sorry.
And so we see a bit of an attempt to remove freed African Americans and freedmen from the United States to kind of alleviate the issues with the states that tried to discourage settlement.
Yeah.
I think a big part of this is actually, Missouri didn't have to go that way. We tend to think Missouri, St. Louis especially, before those laws and moments in time, could have been a diverse place. When we think, and was a diverse place, St. Louis had been around a long time, at least the area. And so when we think of racism, and we think of it in saying being systemic and institutionalized, it's not just ignorance. It's real smart people writing real smart lists, imbuing them with real power into society. And this is extremely problematic then if you're going to try and get rid of it. We're just going to educate people and racism is going to go away. No, we have to challenge these institutions. And the reason that Missouri society partly became racist was because of these institutions, a conscious choice to make laws that made it so. And so to use those same tools against that and to undo it is sometimes challenging and I'm sure frustrating.
So I have a final question on my list. It says, given that the criminal justice system is systematically biased against certain groups and heavily a function of socioeconomic status, would this not mean that the 13th Amendment's labor provision is being applied unfairly? Would that violate due process, and has there ever been a Supreme Court case around this?
So, generally speaking, the Supreme Court does not consider socioeconomic class to be protected or a discrete and unified class of people that could be discriminated against under the Equal Protection Clause. In a case in the 1980s called San Antonio Independent School District v. Rodriguez, the Supreme Court explicitly rejected the idea that just because you were poor and your status as an impoverished or community or a group of people or parents whose property values were lower than other schools serving areas, schools serving in the area, that being poor alone did not unify you as a discrete group for equal protection jurisprudence. Building off of that, my understanding is I'm not aware of a Supreme Court decision in which they have said socioeconomic class in and of itself constitutes unfair application of the criminal justice process. That said, they did hold that, at least as far as access to an attorney goes, that that generally speaking, if you are facing a sentence of more than 6 months in prison, the state has to provide you with an attorney if you are unable to do so. That said, states have very, very low bars as to what counts as being able to afford an attorney. States set those themselves. So even for most people who are very impoverished, most state governments will still say you have enough money to pay for your own attorney.
In a non-criminal context, and y'all may know the actual case, but I know in our Gilded Age, just from reading, that a lot of, and I think there was a Supreme Court case where income tax law was defeated at that time in the 1880s or 1890s by arguing that it was targeting class legislation. That is to say, targeting and punishing punitively the richer class of people at the time, and to taking their money away. And that case, as far as I understood, won until later when we would actually get an income tax and was upheld. But that's obviously not in a criminal context.
So interesting how the Constitution tends to get like more active and dancey when we're talking about, you know, money and
Which class?
power. Yeah. And lots of real estate. Yeah.
We're really low on time. We have time for one more question before we shut down the formal panel. Although people are usually not too fine.
We have one here on Zoom.
Go. Yeah.
All right. How has the 13th Amendment affected gerrymandering then and now? And are there any states that are using gerrymandering to cordon off areas of people of color?
So, to speak to the first part of the question regarding gerrymandering and the 13th Amendment, to speak to it in the prison context, so when we apportion and we district, we require under various Supreme Court decisions that, generally speaking, the population of one district be within 2% variation of this average for however many it would be. So there's a population goal and target that has to be met. And if it varies too much, then there's an unacceptable, unequal distribution, and one person's vote doesn't count as one person's vote in another place. In order to do this, we count every person who resides in the state. We don't count citizens. We don't count. We don't count just people who are of voting age or anything. We count all whole persons. In doing so, we count prison populations. And because we count based on residents, so when we do the census, we count the people who reside in particular prisons towards the apportionment and towards the districts in which they reside. That then means that communities that have prisons can inflate the number of residents in that particular area relative to the number of voters. And we refer to this prison gerrymandering as a means that largely tends to, because of where prisons are placed, increase the size and voting power of conservative rural communities. And that then leads to somewhat of an unequal distribution. It's why a couple of states, Maine and Vermont, actually allow their incarcerated populations to vote while incarcerated. But that's rare. Now, to the second part of the question as to how gerrymandering affects with race, race cannot be the sole purpose for drawing a district, but there can be districts that are designed to potentially favor electing minority candidates. The Supreme Court generally says the districts have to be reasonably compact and is routinely fighting, or well, people are routinely fighting with North Carolina over their maps, and they routinely every 10, 15 years or so end up back before the Supreme Court because of their maps, largely due to the ways in which they draw their majority districts, trying to both concentrate minority vote, but also potentially dilute it in other communities as well.
Are we good? All right. I think we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today, whether you're in the room or joining us through Zoom. We really appreciated this conversation. It was very lively. And as Dr. Shove said, we are all available in the social sciences department and generally like discussing these things in the classroom and just out and about, so we can continue the conversation elsewhere. Thank you.
I learned so much today.